The days after my husband's funeral felt like walking through a house where all the doors had been quietly rearranged in the night. Everything looked familiar, yet nothing fit the way it used to. I moved through the rooms with the slow grace of someone pretending to know where she was going. The kettle whistled at the same time it always had. The morning light still cut across the dining table in the same angled warmth, and the old maple trees outside shed their leaves in the gentle, indifferent way trees do. But inside me, nothing held its shape. The house had become too quiet. I never realized how much noise love made until it was gone. My husband hummed when he read the newspaper. He tapped his fingers on the countertop whenever he was thinking. Even the way he breathed in his sleep filled the house with a rhythm I had long mistaken for silence. And now I sat alone in the place we built together, surrounded by the faint echoes of a life I could still feel, but no longer touch. I tried to keep myself occupied. A woman learns after decades of work and caregiving that the only way to steady the heart is to give the hands something to do. So I folded laundry I didn't need to fold. I rearranged drawers that were already tidy. I washed dishes that were already clean. Anything to fill the hours that had started to stretch like long, empty roads. 2 weeks had passed since the funeral when my children arrived for what they called a family meeting. They said it with the sort of brisk finality that made my stomach tighten. A family meeting. The last time we had one of those was when my daughter announced she was moving across the country. Before that, when my son shared he had chosen a degree that frightened me, though I pretended otherwise. Family meetings were never about love. They were about decisions, and usually decisions they had already made. I heard their cars before I saw them. 2 engines, 2 doors closing, 2 sets of footsteps approaching the porch with the purposeful stride of people who had something to settle. I smoothed the front of my sweater, took a steady breath, and opened the door before they could knock. David strode in first, bringing with him the faint scent of cologne and the sharper scent of certainty. He hugged me in a way that felt more like a pause in his momentum than affection, his eyes already drifting past me into the house, assessing, scanning. Jennifer followed, balancing a leather tote bag stuffed so full that papers peeked out like impatient thoughts. She kissed my cheek, murmured something gentle, then brushed past me with the distracted grace of someone preoccupied by a problem they were eager to solve. They settled at the dining table, the same table where I had once placed birthday cakes and Christmas dinners, where homework had been done and arguments had been soothed. Now it felt like a boardroom. David sat at the head as if by instinct, laptop open before I had even fully taken my seat. Jennifer spread out sketches and printed plans across the hardwood surface, her expression composed but cool. "Mom," she began, her tone thin with practiced sympathy. "We've been talking. We want to help you." Help. I had come to recognize that word. It rarely meant assistance. More often, it meant control wrapped in soft packaging. Jennifer unfolded a large sheet of paper. At first glance, it looked like a design plan for a small apartment. A kitchenette, a bathroom, a narrow bedroom. Then I realized what it truly was. A basement layout. My basement layout. Redesigned into something that looked less like a living space and more like a holding cell wearing a polite disguise. David cleared his throat. "We just want you to be safe. The house is too big for you now." Too big. A strange phrase after a lifetime of filling this house with laughter, meals, and long evenings. Now it was apparently too much for a widow. Not a woman. A widow. A title that seemed to erase everything else. Jennifer tapped the drawing with her manicured finger. "This is just a temporary solution, until we figure out something more suitable long-term." More suitable. I looked at their faces. My daughter wore a look of gentle condescension that reminded me of times she had corrected me on minor things as a child. Except now the stakes were larger. My son looked at me as one would look at a fragile object, one they admired, but whose usefulness had expired. I kept my voice steady. "May I ask what you mean by suitable?" David hesitated for a moment too long. "Well, eventually, selling the house would give you a more manageable lifestyle." A more manageable lifestyle. I nearly laughed at the phrasing. I had managed a household, a marriage, a career, and 2 children who had been anything but simple. But apparently, widowhood had altered the math of my competence. They continued their presentation, their voices intertwining into a rehearsed narrative about planning and efficiency and responsibility. They used phrases like asset allocation and long-term sustainability. They spoke as if I were not the woman who created the home whose walls surrounded them. For a moment, I felt something cold move through me. A realization I had tried to avoid for years. They were not speaking as my children. They were speaking as heirs. Halfway through Jennifer's explanation of how the basement apartment would free up space, she paused and glanced toward the study down the hallway. "Did Dad ever update those files he kept in there?" she asked. I answered carefully. "Which files?" "The financial ones," she said lightly. "I always wondered if he kept records we should look at." She said it casually, but her eyes flickered, and something sharp and calculating passed through her expression. I had seen that look before, years ago when she tried to persuade her father to co-sign a loan she did not need. He had refused. She never forgot it. The conversation went on for some time, and each sentence they spoke chipped a little more at the foundation of the life I thought we shared. But what broke me was not their tone or their plans. It was their certainty. They already believed I would agree. When they finally left, promising to return with updated drafts and a timeline, I stood alone in the silent house with the papers still spread on the table. The rooms seemed to tilt slightly, as if the weight of their intentions had shifted the structure. I gathered the papers slowly, folding them with a care they did not deserve. I placed them in a drawer. Then I walked down the hallway toward the study, my footsteps soft against the floorboards my husband once polished every autumn. I closed the door behind me, and for the first time since his death, I wondered, what exactly had my husband been trying to protect me from? I stood in the doorway of my husband's study for a long moment before entering. That room had always belonged more to him than to either of us, not because he kept it locked, or because he spoke of it with mystery, but because a certain stillness lived within those walls. It was the stillness of a man who thought before he spoke, who prepared before he acted, who planned 3 steps ahead even when everyone else thought he was standing still. The study looked exactly as it had the last day he sat in it. His reading glasses were on the desk, resting on top of a book he had stopped halfway through. A ceramic mug sat on a coaster, the faint ring inside now dry. A small stack of envelopes was neatly arranged beside the lamp. My husband had been a man who believed that order was just another form of kindness. Make everything easy to find so no one else had to struggle. I walked in slowly, running my fingers along the edge of his desk. The wood felt warm, familiar, like the back of a hand you have held 1,000 times. I opened the top drawer, expecting nothing more than pens and paper clips. Instead, I found exactly that. Pens aligned, paper clips nested like silver birds, everything as it should be. The second drawer held file folders arranged alphabetically, insurance documents, tax returns, old receipts from a life measured in careful accounting. I flipped through them without knowing exactly what I hoped to find. A hint, a warning, a goodbye. Grief does strange things to the mind. It makes you believe that the dead might have left clues for you to follow, like breadcrumbs scattered through your memories. Then, in the third drawer, the bottom one, I stopped. A pale blue folder sat inside, the color out of place among the manila and gray. It was the only blue item in the entire drawer. And the sight of it took the breath from my chest because my husband was not a man who chose things by accident. If something was different, he meant it to be. I lifted the folder gently, almost reverently. The paper was thick, the kind that doesn't bend easily. There was no label on the front, but I noticed a faint indentation, as if he had held it many times before, or prepared it slowly, thoughtfully, in the days when he knew time was slipping away from him. I carried it to the desk and sat in his chair. It creaked in the same familiar way, and for a moment I felt him there beside me, a quiet presence, steady and certain. Inside the folder were documents I did not recognize at first. Maps, schedules, letters with foreign stamps, property records written in a language I had not seen since our honeymoon decades ago. And then, tucked in the center, a single-page note in his handwriting. My hands trembled when I opened it. His handwriting had always been neat, as if each letter bowed politely to the next. I read the first line, and my heart began to pound. Evie, if you are reading this, it means you are alone now, and I am sorry for that. I blinked hard, tears forming in the corners of my eyes. I read the next line slowly. I need you to know something. I have seen what our children are becoming. I have seen the way they watch our home, not as a place of memory, but as something they believe they are owed. This is not your burden to carry. I am leaving you something they cannot touch. I swallowed, unable to breathe for a moment. He had known. Long before I could admit it to myself, he had known. I read the rest. You remember the trip we took to Portugal years ago? What I did not tell you then is that I returned later to finalize something. There is a villa in the Algarve region that belongs only to you. Not to them, not to anyone. I placed it in your name deliberately. If the day comes when you feel squeezed out of this home or treated like a burden, you must go there. You deserve peace more than anyone I know, and I trust you to know when the time is right. My breath left me in a single shudder. A villa. A place he had built for me without ever telling me. A safe harbor constructed quietly, patiently, long before I knew I would need it. The next pages confirmed everything. Deeds, bank letters, tax records, all in my name, all untouched, all meticulously arranged so no one else could interfere. I leaned back in his chair, the weight of the discovery pressing into me like a truth I had always sensed but never had evidence for. My husband had protected our family his entire life, sometimes from outsiders, sometimes from harsh circumstances, and sometimes, though I did not want to admit it, from our own children. But this was different. This was protection he believed I would one day need against the very people we raised. A log of every maintenance Anna Santos had handled. Photos of the villa over the years. Sunlit terraces. Stone walls the color of warm sand. Rooms with high ceilings and windows that opened to the sea. It felt like touching a future he had kept safe for me. I looked around the study, the quiet pressing in. My children had sat in my dining room that very morning discussing my life as if it were a math problem to solve. They had spoken about my home with the clinical detachment of people assigning value rather than meaning. And yet, in this room, my husband had left me the opposite of what they offered: freedom. It was then, staring at the sprawling coastline photographs, that a thought crept into me so silently it felt like it had always been there. Maybe it was time to go. Not because I was weak, not because I was incapable, but because I deserved a life that wasn't measured in square footage or efficiency or obligation. A life that wasn't waiting to be assessed by people who believed widowhood made me expendable. The house groaned softly as the wind pushed against the siding. In that moment, I was struck by how fragile certain things truly are. Trust, respect, the illusion that family always acts out of love. I closed the folder gently and lifted my gaze toward the window overlooking the backyard. The maple trees stood tall, the last of their leaves trembling in the breeze. Beyond them, the night settled quietly over the garden my husband had tended for half a lifetime. I stood slowly, holding the pale blue folder against my chest. And that was when I heard it. A faint sound from the hallway, like a step retreating just out of sight. I turned. The hallway was empty, but I knew I had not been alone in the house for at least part of that moment. The house felt different the next morning, as if the air itself had shifted. I moved through the kitchen with the pale blue folder tucked inside my cardigan like a secret heartbeat. Something had awakened in me during the night. A clarity. A stillness that was not resignation, but recognition. When a woman reaches my age, she learns to listen to the quiet spaces between events, the pauses, the hesitations, the things unsaid. And the moment I found that folder, the silence around my children's visit the day before took on a new shape. For years, I had excused their tone as worry, their interference as misguided love, their suggestions as concern. But now, looking back with new eyes, I saw a pattern. Small comments over holidays, questions about my retirement account at birthdays, their sudden interest in the value of my home, their shared glances whenever I mentioned projects I wanted to start. Worry is gentle, concern is warm. But what they had shown me yesterday was neither. I made myself tea and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam rising from the cup. The morning sun fell across the hardwood in a patchwork of gold. The house remained as it always was, faithful, unchanging. But the people inside it had altered, or maybe I had simply stopped pretending otherwise. My eyes drifted toward the hallway. The sound I heard the previous night, a soft step, a movement, hung in the back of my mind like a thread not yet pulled. I told myself it was nothing. Old houses make noises. Grief makes the mind sensitive. But even as I tried to brush the thought away, it stayed there, quiet and patient. By mid-morning, the first message came. From David. We should finalize a plan by the end of the week. I want to bring a contractor on Saturday. The end of the week. Not your timeline. Not your comfort. His. I deleted the message without replying. Shortly after, Jennifer called. Her voice was bright, polished, too cheerful. The kind of tone people use when they are giving bad news dressed as an opportunity. Mom, I've been thinking. We should start sorting the house soon. Decluttering will help you. It's therapeutic. Therapeutic. As if removing the last traces of my life with my husband was a spa treatment. I told her I was resting and ended the call before she could say more. The rest of the day passed quietly. I folded towels that did not need folding. I swept a perfectly clean floor. I moved through the house with the strange feeling that someone had tilted the axis slightly, and only I could feel it. It wasn't until early evening that my suspicion took root. I returned to the study again, drawn there like a moth to the last warm flame of my marriage. The pale blue folder was still tucked away beneath a stack of magazines in the bottom drawer. I sat in my husband's chair, feeling its worn cushion shape itself to me, the way it had shaped itself to him for decades. I opened the top drawer, intending to find a pen. That was all, just a pen. But the pen was not what I found. Instead, I found something that did not belong. A small, narrow strip of paper, torn from a grocery receipt, caught between the folders as if someone had dropped it and then hurried away. It listed items I had not purchased: coffee beans, granola, a protein bar. My children bought those things. I did not. I stared at the receipt for a long moment, my heart steady, slow. There was no reason for it to be there. I had not been grocery shopping in days. I had not even opened this drawer since my husband's death. Someone had been in this room. Not yesterday, not today, before, possibly many times. A cold understanding moved through me. The basement plans, the urgency, the glances toward the study, the questions about files, the way Jennifer had asked whether he kept important records in here. They had not stumbled into their concerns. They had been building toward this. Quietly, strategically, predictably. And the pale blue folder, my husband's last protection, had been sitting in the open until the day he died. What if they had found it then? What if they had searched the study in the first days afterward? What if they had rifled through the drawers, not expecting I would notice, not expecting I would ever question? If this folder had still been in that middle drawer where he normally kept important papers, they would have. But it wasn't. My husband had known. He had hidden it in the bottom drawer beneath mundane things. Magazines, old photo envelopes, tax documents, layer upon layer of ordinary life. He must have known that if our children ever crossed the line between concern and greed, they would begin with the obvious places. I closed the drawer gently, fear replaced by something sharper. The kind of awareness that comes to a woman only after she has lived enough years to recognize when she is being cornered. I walked down the hallway again, slowly this time, paying attention to every sound. The way the floorboard creaked near the linen closet, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the muted tick of the clock, the comforting sounds of a home. But underneath them, I felt something else, a presence, not physical, not immediate, but lingering, like footprints still warm in the snow. Someone had been in this house, recently, and not as a visitor, as an investigator. I made myself dinner I barely tasted. The quiet settled heavy around me, the kind that reveals more than it conceals. I spent the evening reading through my husband's letter again and again, letting his words steady me. When the time is right, you will know. He had written that with certainty. He believed in my judgment even when I doubted it myself. The sun dipped low, turning the windows into mirrors. I caught my reflection, smaller than I remembered, older than I felt, but with an expression I had not seen on my face in a long time. Not fear, not grief, resolve. Night fell. The house dimmed. I moved room to room, turning off lights, my steps soft against the familiar floorboards. When I reached my bedroom door, I paused. A faint line of light shone under the study door. I had turned that light off. My breath stilled. I listened. Silence. Yet the light remained. I stepped slowly toward the study, each step deliberate, my hand brushing the wall for balance, even though I did not need it. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, and inside, something was out of place, something important, something that told me whatever my children intended yesterday was only the beginning, and that someone else had been here tonight. The moment I stepped inside the study, the air changed. There is a particular stillness a room carries when something private has been disturbed. It is subtle, but a woman who has spent a lifetime maintaining order can sense even the smallest displacement, the way one senses an opened window or a shifted shadow. The desk lamp was on. I had turned it off. It wasn't bright enough to illuminate the room fully, but it cast a warm circle of light across the papers on the desk. Papers I knew for certain had not been left out. The pale blue folder, thank God, was still hidden in the drawer where I had placed it. But the rest of the desk was wrong. Things were slightly angled instead of straight. A pen lay diagonally across a notebook instead of resting in the tray. A coaster had been nudged a few inches from its usual place. Nothing looked stolen, but everything looked touched. The most unsettling part was how neat the disturbance was. Whoever had been in this room wasn't searching in panic or haste. They were deliberate, careful, controlled. They wanted to see without leaving evidence, or they believed I would not notice. I walked toward the desk slowly, examining the surface with an eye sharpened by memory. My husband had been meticulous. He would sometimes tease me for rearranging a room, only to put everything back where it belonged in the end. We were a pair of orderly souls. When you share a life with someone like that, you learn to recognize patterns, and you learn when a pattern has been broken. Beside the desk lamp, a small stack of papers had been moved about half an inch from center. That may seem like nothing to most people, but I knew better. It was enough to signal that someone had lifted them, or slid them, or leaned on them. I opened the top drawer. The pens were there, but the blue one, the one I used most often, was missing from its place. I found it under the small notepad buried toward the back. Not lost, not misplaced, hidden. My pulse stayed calm, but my mind sharpened with every detail. Whoever was inside my study last night moved with intention. They were not curious. They were searching. But then I saw it. A faint smudge on the edge of the desk drawer. A fingerprint made from someone with lotion or oil on their hands. My husband's hands were never oily. Mine were always dry. My daughter's hands were neat but never soft. My son's palms were rough from weight training. This fingerprint had belonged to someone who moisturized regularly, someone who wore a floral scent that lingered on the air, someone who had been in my kitchen often enough for me to know the fragrance. Jennifer. Her perfume was faint, but unmistakable. I stood there, breathing slowly through my nose until the initial sting of betrayal settled into something steadier, something colder. My daughter had been in this room recently. Not yesterday. Not the day before. The room was too still for that. The disturbance was older. Perhaps the week of the funeral, when family drifted in and out of the house under the vague excuse of helping. That was the perfect time to search. A grieving widow is an easy person to overlook. I pulled the desk chair out and sat. The leather sighed beneath me. From this angle, I could see the small scratches my husband's wedding ring had left in the finish over the years. 1,000 gentle reminders that his hands had shaped more than this desk. He had shaped a life I cherished. And now, even in death, he had left something for me to hold on to. The pale blue folder, the villa, the future he had safeguarded from the very outcome unfolding before me. I stood and quietly checked the windows. Locked. No signs of forced entry. Then I checked the hallway. Empty. The rest of the house held nothing unusual. No open drawers, no shifted surfaces, no strange marks. Only the study carried the trace. It dawned on me then. They hadn't searched the whole house. They had searched only where they believed something valuable might be hidden. The study. My husband's records, his documents, his plans. Which meant they believed something was here. Some record, some wealth, some key they needed to proceed. And if they believed that, then they were already further into their private calculations than I had realized. I found myself walking back toward the kitchen, the room where the day always began and always ended. I stood by the counter, staring at the kettle, thinking of all the mornings I had spent pouring tea for my children, teaching them patience, kindness, understanding. Lessons I once thought had taken root. I reached for a clean cup, but then something caught my eye. A faint indentation in the dust near the windowsill above the sink. A shape about the size of a phone or a camera. Someone had rested something there. A device. A recorder. Or maybe they had simply placed their phone there while pretending to help me tidy up. I wiped the space clean with the dish towel. There is a specific kind of chill that runs through a woman when she realizes the people she raised have begun to see her not as a mother, but as an obstacle. I poured myself tea, needing the warmth to settle the tremor in my hands. Not fear, not nerves, something else, something steadier, something long suppressed. Resolve. I took my cup to the dining table and sat, allowing the weight of what I'd uncovered to settle fully. My children were not planning my safety. They were planning their convenience. And something about their urgency, David's message, Jennifer's call, the way they glanced toward the study, told me they wanted to move quickly, as if time mattered, as if something depended on their ability to get me to agree before I asked too many questions, before I opened the wrong drawer, before I found the folder. A soft thud echoed somewhere deeper in the house, pulling my attention sharply toward the hallway. Not a falling object, not a shifting board, something heavier, something intentional, the kind of sound made by a door settling after being quietly closed. I set my cup down, the porcelain clicking softly against the table. Someone else was in the house, and this time, they had not come to leave things the way they found them. I did not sleep the night I realized someone else had been in my home. Sleep requires a sense of safety, and safety had quietly slipped out of my house the moment I found that faint smudge on the desk drawer. The house was as familiar as the lines on my palms, yet in the darkness it felt like a stranger watching me from across the room. I kept the lights low, moving from window to window, from hallway to hallway, listening to the walls breathe. The quiet was heavy, but not empty. It felt like a held breath. Something waiting, something watching. My children would never see themselves as threats, yet their actions cast long shadows. The kind of shadows that stretch when someone thinks no one is paying attention. By dawn, I found myself once again inside my husband's study. I had not turned on the lamp this time. I wanted the room exactly as it was. Early light filtered through the curtains, revealing just enough while hiding the rest. Dust motes drifted lazily in the beams, the only movement in a room that carried the weight of a man's careful mind. And that was when I realized something important. My husband had not been surprised by the path our children were now on. He had predicted it. Not because they were cruel, but because they had slowly become people who measured love by what it could give them. People raised in comfort sometimes grow blind to the hands that built that comfort. My husband had seen that truth years ago, maybe long before I did. I opened the bottom drawer. The pale blue folder waited inside like a truth that had always been patient. I placed it on the desk and began to examine every page, not skimming now, but reading with the precision of a woman who knows the ground beneath her is shifting. There were letters addressed to me, each sealed in its own envelope. Each dated years apart. Each opened cleanly as if he had once expected to hand them to me himself. The earliest letter was gentle, a reflection on the future, a reassurance that he had secured accounts with my name first. The kind of letter a husband writes when he is thinking about the natural timeline of life. But the later ones were different. The handwriting remained steady, but the tone shifted. He wrote about conversations he overheard between our children, comments that made him uneasy, their interest in downsizing long before we were ready, their remarks about potential renovations if the house were ever to change hands, their casual questions about my insurance policies. He admitted that at first he thought he was imagining it, that he was reading too much into their words. But then he wrote about a conversation he overheard between them at a holiday dinner. A conversation about planning for the long run. He underlined that phrase. I sat in his chair, the letter trembling slightly in my hands. I read the last paragraph twice, unable to look away. If I am gone first, Evie, I need you to be prepared. Our children love us, but they see the world differently than we do. They see worth in things, not in the years spent earning them. If you ever feel cornered, do not argue, do not fight. Leave before they take anything from you. There is a home waiting for you in the Algarve. Use it when the time comes. The time had come, not suddenly, not violently, but quietly, like a tide rising around my ankles. I closed the folder and rested my hand on top of it. My husband had not raised a fortress around me. He had given me a door, a way out, a choice. And choices are more powerful than walls. But I was not ready to walk through that door yet, not until I understood everything. Late that morning, I decided to look deeper into the house itself. Not the rooms, the patterns, the traces of movement left behind by my children. I found subtle signs everywhere. In the linen closet, the stack of towels had been rearranged, not drastically, just enough that the oldest ones, the ones with small embroidered initials stitched by my mother years ago, had been moved farther back. A detail no one would notice unless they had been the one to fold them first. In the hallway cabinet, the emergency folder that held our insurance papers had been placed in reverse order. My husband always arranged them by date, newest in front. Now the oldest lay at the top, and in the kitchen, the silverware drawer had a faint, unfamiliar scent to it. Not floral, not sweet. It smelled faintly of almond oil. Jennifer. She had been in nearly every room. David left fewer traces. He was cleaner in his movements, tidier in his habits. But I noticed that the vent in the dining room, usually angled upward, was now aimed slightly downward. My husband used to adjust it to help distribute heat evenly when we entertained. There had been no guests lately. The only explanation was that someone had leaned against it or knelt in front of it, perhaps while placing a phone on the windowsill. I walked through my home slowly, the pale blue folder now tucked under my arm. I felt like a woman reading the final pages of a book she once believed ended differently. It was not anger that moved through me. It was clarity, a clarity that comes only when illusions finally fall. By the time afternoon settled in, I had made my decision. I went back into the study, took the pale blue folder, and placed it on the dining table. I rewrote my husband's notes in my own hand, organized the documents into categories, and then retrieved my old travel binder from the hallway cabinet. I had not used that binder since the Algarve trip years ago. It still held maps, brochures, ticket stubs. I placed the villa papers neatly inside. There was something grounding about the process, tactical, methodical, like laying bricks for a walkway toward a future I could step into when the moment came. That was when I remembered the name printed on one of the letters, Anna Santos. She had been a quiet presence during our trip to Portugal, a woman with calm eyes and a firm handshake. I remembered my husband speaking to her privately while I toured a local market. He had said she was a trusted friend of someone he once worked with. At the time, I didn't ask questions. Marriage teaches you what to question and what to accept. That day, I accepted. Now her name carried weight. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the number he had written in the margin of one of the papers. It was an international number, written carefully, as if he expected me to hesitate before dialing. I pressed the call button and held my breath. The line rang twice before a woman answered, her voice calm, warm, and steady. "Evelyn Hayes?" she asked, not surprised, not uncertain. My heart tightened. "Yes, this is Evelyn." She exhaled softly. "I have been waiting for this call." Her words settled into me like a truth I had long known but never fully named. Waiting, not hoping. Waiting carries certainty. I closed my eyes, steadying my voice. "I found the folder." "All right," she said gently. Then your husband's plan is ready. The villa is in perfect condition. It is yours, and you will be safe here when the time comes. The time comes. Not if, when. How did you know I would call today? I asked. Your husband told me, she replied, her tone measured. He said you would call when the wolves came. The phone pressed warm against my ear as her words settled around me. My husband had chosen those words deliberately. He must have known exactly the kind of forces that would someday gather at my door. Anna, I whispered, they're here. I know, she said quietly. Then take your time, but do not delay your decisions. Wolves rarely stop once they have tasted a path. That sentence sent a ripple of calm and fear through me at once. Calm because she understood. Fear because she was not wrong. I ended the call with the quiet resolve of someone who has made a decision they cannot unmake. The next day, my children returned. They did not call first. Their knocks were firm, urgent, the kind of knock reserved for police and people who believe they have rights over you. I opened the door, greeting them with the same calm I used to soothe them after childhood nightmares. Jennifer walked in with the brisk confidence of someone preparing for a negotiation. David followed, carrying a folder I recognized from the finance seminar he once attended. They sat at the dining table without asking. Mom, Jennifer began, we need to talk about timelines. David nodded. I've spoken with 2 contractors. They can begin next week. Next week, I repeated quietly, as if tasting the words. Jennifer spread her papers across the table again, unaware I had already memorized every insult hidden within the neat lines of those plans. We're thinking it's best to finalize everything before spring, she said. That gives us time to list the house by early summer. Real estate is strong this year. I folded my hands neatly on the table. You plan to sell the house. Jennifer's eyes flickered. Not sell, transition, move toward something sustainable. For whom? I asked softly. Neither answered. Their silence told me everything. Not for me. Not for my comfort. Not for my safety. For themselves. They didn't realize yet that their plans were already dust, that the house they coveted so carefully no longer belonged to the future they imagined. I waited until they finished their explanation, until their voices blended into the practiced cadence of people who believe they are being reasonable. Then I rose, walked to the study, and returned carrying a single sheet of paper. I placed it on the table between them. This, I said quietly, is the Conservation Trust. The house is no longer mine to sell. It belongs to your children, not to you. Jennifer froze. David blinked. Shock is a soundless thing. It collapses inside the body before the mind can process it. You did this? Jennifer whispered. I nodded calmly. 2 days ago. David tried to speak, failed, then tried again. Without telling us? I held his gaze. You do not ask permission from wolves to build a gate. Silence flooded the room. Not anger, not grief. Something deeper. A recognition that the chessboard they believed they controlled had been flipped in a move they never saw coming. Jennifer pushed back her chair so sharply the legs scraped the floor. I cannot believe you would do this to us. To you? I repeated. You came here to dismantle my life. I simply chose not to let you. David stood next, pacing with the frustrated movements of a man who cannot control an outcome that matters to him. This isn't fair, he said. For the first time since their father's funeral, I allowed myself to smile. Small, sad, but certain. Fairness, I murmured. Left this house when you started calculating my worth in square footage. Jennifer gathered her papers with trembling hands. So what now? Now, I said. I leave. David stared at me. Leave? Where would you even go? To a place your father prepared for me. His eyes narrowed. What place? I did not answer. Some doors, once opened, are not meant for others to walk through. I walked to the window, looking out at the maple trees, their branches swaying in the faint afternoon wind. You may leave now, I said softly. There is nothing left here for either of you to manage. Jennifer looked stunned. You can't just disappear. I turned to her, my voice quiet but unshakable. My dear, I said, that is exactly what I am going to do. And in that stillness, with the late sun casting long shadows across the dining table, I realized something with absolute clarity. They did not fear losing me. They feared losing access to me, a very different thing. They left without another word. Their engines started. Their cars reversed down the driveway. The gravel crackled beneath their tires. And when the house fell silent again, truly silent, I allowed myself to breathe. I walked back into the study, opened the window just slightly, letting in the cool air, and sat beside the pale blue folder. My husband had not abandoned me to this loneliness. He had built a new life for me long before he took his last breath. A life in a quiet villa on the Algarve coast. A place where the wind carried nothing but the scent of the sea. A place where the wolves could not follow. I folded the last letter from my husband, placed it carefully in the folder, and held it against my chest. Tomorrow, I would book the flight. Tonight, I would savor the last dusk in a house that had sheltered both my happiest years and my hardest truths. But as the light faded and the house darkened, I heard something outside. A car engine, slow, careful, stopping near the gate. I went to the front window, keeping behind the curtain. Headlights cut across the lawn. I recognized the car. And in that moment, I realized my children were not the only ones who had been watching this house. Someone else had been waiting. And now, they had returned. The car outside idled for a long moment, its engine low and cautious, as if the driver were debating whether to step into the light or fade back into the shadows. I stayed behind the curtain, my breath steady, my fingers curled lightly around the pale blue folder held close to my chest. I waited. The engine finally cut off. Silence followed, the kind that carries weight. Then a door opened softly. Gravel shifted under steps that tried their best not to be heard. Whoever had come back did not want to announce themselves. That alone told me enough. My children barged. They insisted. They rattled doorknobs and knocked with urgency, their voices full of entitlement and impatience. This step, the slow, measured one, was someone else. I stayed in the shadows, my heartbeat calm, my mind clear. A lifetime of reading rooms and tempers teaches a woman how to sense intention long before she sees a face. The figure finally reached the porch. A faint knock sounded, polite, tentative, almost apologetic. I recognized that kind of knock. It belonged to someone who was not here to take something. I opened the door a cautious width. My neighbor, Agnes Weller, stood on the step, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. A widow for as long as I had known her, the kind of woman who noticed everything but rarely commented. Her eyes were soft, but alert, the way a nurse watches a patient for signs they aren't ready to admit. I saw your children leave, she said quietly. They didn't look happy. I motioned her inside before she drew attention, and she stepped past me with the graceful caution of someone who had always respected boundaries others ignored. I didn't want to intrude, she continued, but I thought you might need something warm, or someone to sit with you for a while. She held up a small container, soup by the smell of it, and for a moment a wave of emotion pressed against my ribs. Not grief, not fear, relief. Not everyone in this world arrived with spreadsheets and expectations. Some came carrying warmth and a quiet kind of loyalty. We sat at the dining table, the pale blue folder tucked safely beneath my arm. I did not show her the documents. I did not need to. But she watched my face with the kind of familiarity only another older woman could possess. "You look like someone who just made a decision," she said softly. "I have," I replied, "and you look like someone who will not undo that decision." "I won't." Agnes nodded once, firmly, as if that was all she needed to know. "Then whatever comes next," she said, "you won't be facing it alone. Just remember that. You have neighbors, friends, people who understand what it means when family forgets the meaning of the word." Her words warmed me more than the soup ever could. We spoke for a short while, about weather, errands, the sort of small talk that gently lowers a woman back into herself after she has been shaken. Eventually, she stood, touched my arm, and left without asking questions. Some kindnesses are so pure they demand no explanations. After she left, I walked slowly back into the study. I gathered my documents, my husband's letters, and the last of the papers I would need to leave this life behind. The sun had dipped below the horizon. Night spread across the rooms like a soft blanket, not ominous this time, just a reminder that endings are part of the natural rhythm. I had promised myself I would book the flight in the morning. But something in me shifted as I stood there with the folder pressed to my chest. Morning suddenly felt too far away. So I packed, not hastily, not fearfully, deliberately. I took only what I needed: a few clothes, the letters, the documents, a photograph of my husband taken in the early days of our marriage, one good cookbook, my mother's little locket. Everything else I left behind, because a woman who knows her own worth does not need to carry more than the life she is stepping toward. By midnight, my suitcase sat by the door. By dawn, I had not slept, but I felt more rested than I had in weeks. At sunrise, I stood at the window and watched the first light spill across the yard. The maple trees glowed in pale gold. The house was quiet, not the suffocating quiet of grief, but the grounded quiet of completion. I made myself tea, sat at the dining table one last time, and waited. Because I knew my children would return, not for me, for the house they believed they were losing. They arrived mid-morning, their cars stopping abruptly, their doors slamming with the force of people who had not expected consequences. Jennifer marched up the walkway with hurried steps, her face set in a rigid line. David trailed behind her, his jaw clenched, his pulse visible at his temple. I opened the door before they knocked. I did not want the neighbors hearing raised voices. Jennifer stepped forward first. "Mom, this is absurd. You can't just hand everything over to a trust. You didn't even talk to us." "I didn't need your permission," I replied calmly. David ran a hand through his hair. "We were only trying to help." "Help," I repeated, letting the words settle between us like a quiet truth, "is not something you ambush people with." Jennifer's eyes flared. "We need to discuss alternatives." "There are no alternatives." She stared at my suitcase. Then her eyes widened in disbelief. "You're leaving." "Yes." "Where?" she demanded, as if the answer belonged to her. "Somewhere peaceful." "Mom," David said sharply, "this is reckless." "No," I said quietly. "What I allowed yesterday was reckless. What I allowed for years was reckless. Today is not." Jennifer stepped closer, lowering her voice into something she likely thought persuasive. "You're acting out of grief. You're not thinking clearly." I held her gaze with a stillness she could not penetrate. "Clarity is the only thing I have." Their eyes flicked to the suitcase again, then back to my face. They realized then what they had lost. Not an inheritance, not money, control. And without control, They had nothing to anchor themselves to. "Mom," David said, his voice softening despite himself. "We're your children." "Yes," I said, "and I loved you enough to hope that would be enough." Jennifer swallowed hard. "You can't leave." "I can," I said, "and I will." They both spoke then, their voices overlapping, offering reasons, demands, strategies, even apologies. Each one carried a tone that might have pulled at my heart years ago. But the space inside me where guilt once lived had quieted. Their urgency washed over me like water over stone, unable to sink in. I lifted the handle of my suitcase with one hand and placed the pale blue folder inside my shoulder bag. My husband's handwriting brushed against my fingers like a blessing. "This house," I said softly, "will be here for your children, not for you." Jennifer's face crumpled for a brief moment, not with remorse, but with loss, a loss of something she believed she deserved. "You'll regret this," she whispered. "Perhaps," I said, "but regret is lighter than resentment." David's shoulders sagged. "We didn't mean to push you." "Yes," I said evenly. "You did." The honesty stunned them. I stepped past them, closed the door behind me, and walked down the porch steps. The fresh morning air touched my face gently, like the world itself welcoming me into a new chapter. They followed me to the driveway, but did not try to stop me. Perhaps they sensed it would make things worse. Perhaps they realized some tides cannot be turned. Or perhaps they were waiting to see if I would falter. But I didn't. I placed my suitcase in the back seat of the taxi I'd called an hour earlier. The driver nodded politely, not asking questions. I opened the passenger door and looked back only once. My children stood together, united not by love but by shock. A realization settled over me in that moment, quiet and absolute. They would grow from this, or they wouldn't. But either way, I was done shrinking, so they could remain comfortable. I got into the taxi, and it carried me away from the house that had held both my beginnings and my endings. The airport was bustling, but I felt strangely insulated from the noise. As if I walked in the eye of a storm. People hurried past me. Families gathered near luggage belts. Announcements echoed overhead. But my mind drifted to my husband's letter. "You deserve peace." I checked in, moved through the gates, boarded the plane with a small blanket folded over my arm. The seat beside me stayed empty. I pressed my head against the window and watched the world shrink beneath me as the plane lifted into the sky. Hours later, when the ocean spread beneath us like a shimmering quilt of shifting blues, I closed my eyes and let the hum of the engines lull me into a quiet I had not known in years. By the time the plane descended, the sun was lowering over the Atlantic, painting the sky in colors I had no words for. The air that met me at the door was warm, carrying a scent of salt and citrus. Portugal welcomed me with open arms. Ana Santos met me just outside the gate. She was older now, silver threaded through her dark hair, her eyes lined with the delicate creases of a woman who had smiled often despite hard years. "You look tired," she said gently, touching my arm. "I am," I replied, "but it's the good kind." She nodded once, in a way that told me she understood exactly what I meant. We drove through winding roads toward the Algarve coast. The ocean glimmered through olive trees, catching the light like a secret that refused to stay hidden. The villa appeared like something from a painting: whitewashed walls, terracotta roof, a courtyard framed by bougainvillea. "This is yours," Anna said softly. "He wanted it to feel like a sanctuary." "It does," I whispered. Inside, the rooms were filled with warm colors and soft textures, not extravagant, not elaborate, but peaceful, the kind of home built by someone who believed comfort needed space to breathe. Anna walked me through each room, explaining the things my husband had arranged. He had left letters for me in several drawers, instructions, notes, reminders of the life he hoped I would live. "He trusted you," I said. "Your husband was a good man," she replied. "He asked me to watch over this place for you. I promised him I would." I opened the windows and let the sea breeze sweep through the villa. It carried away the last remnants of fear clinging to my ribs. I could feel the house settle around me, not as a stranger, but as a protector. "This is where you begin again," Anna said. I turned to her. "And what happens now?" She smiled gently. "Now you learn to rest, to breathe, to be someone other than the person your children expected you to be." Her words settled into me like a truth I had long been bracing myself to hear. After she left, I walked slowly through the villa. I touched the cool tiles of the hallway. I stood on the balcony overlooking the sea. The waves moved steadily, patient and eternal. For the first time in a long time, I felt no need to rush. I sat in a wooden chair near the terrace, opened my husband's final letter, and read it as the sun dipped below the horizon. "You have always carried our family with grace, even when they forgot how much weight you bore. Now it is time for you to live lightly. Build a life where your days belong to you. I'll meet you in every sunrise." Tears filled my eyes, not from sorrow, but from release. The first night in the villa was quiet, the kind of quiet that heals instead of harms. I slept with the windows open, the sea whispering against the rocks below. And in the early hours of the morning, when the world was still gray and soft, I woke to a sense of something easing inside me, a peace descending, a truth settling, a life opening. I stepped out onto the balcony and watched the first light of dawn spill across the water. I thought of my children, of what they had tried to take, of what they had forced me to see. I did not hate them. I did not resent them. I simply understood them now. They had been raised in a world that measured worth by possession. I had been raised in a world that measured it by gratitude. Perhaps one day they would understand the difference. Perhaps they wouldn't. But that would be their story. And this, standing in the golden light of a place built for me by a man who loved me without conditions, this was mine. A new beginning, quiet, measured, hard-earned, and profoundly my own. I closed my eyes, breathed in the salt air, and whispered into the dawn, "I am home."